Thank you to everyone. Welcome. We want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us on our webinar. Please feel welcome to add any questions that you might have throughout the presentation via the Q&A buttons that are below or potentially above on your screen. And at the end of the session, we're planning to open up a Q&A session where we'll answer any questions you've had throughout the presentation or that you might come up with at the time. So a very quick introduction to AEL. My name is Angie. I'm in charge of sales and marketing for AEL, and it's my mission to ensure that our potential clients are aware of us and the services that we offer to support you. So for those of you who don't know AEL, we are a consulting firm, and we specialize in environmental consulting, and we have a focus on providing practical solutions for managing environmental risk for property owners, buyers, lenders, and those that are in leasing situations. We support commercial and real estate transactions, but we also support a number of public sector entities, developers, municipalities, private businesses, and even residential clients. Gavin, can you advance the slide? There we go. Awesome. So AEL, we work across the country. We do work primarily in Canada, but we work in cities. We work in remote locations. We do have a lot of experience actually doing fly-in and boat-in and ice road sites. So we've got a team of experienced project managers who can take us in and out of difficult locations, as well as those that are much closer to home. Our head office is in Mississauga, Ontario. And to give you an idea, so today we're here to focus on remedial situations, a complex remedial situation, but we do offer a number of additional services for our clients, such as environmental site assessments, soil, groundwater, air sampling and monitoring, building condition assessments, aerial surveys, peer reviews, and a whole lot more. We have a number of other webinars and resources that are already available on our website, and we're also happy to present on any areas of our subject matter expertise. And we even will do private sessions upon request. So you'll see at the end of the webinar, you'll get a link that's going to actually ask you if you have any additional webinar topics that you'd like to participate in or that you'd like to see from us. And we welcome your feedback on that. So presenting with us today is my colleague, Gavin Overbeeke. He is a professional geoscientist and remediation specialist, and he has a very thorough understanding of the hydrogeological processes with a focus on subsurface contaminant fate. So I think you'll really enjoy the presentation. Gavin has a real knack of delivering content in a way that resonates and makes sense. But if it doesn't, or if you've got more questions, by all means, put them in the Q&A and we will address them at the end. And if you have follow-up, we'll include Gavin's contact information at the end of the presentation as well. And so the very quick overview, Gavin's going to use, we're going to go through a very specific case study today to demonstrate an ex-situ remedial approach on a large hydrocarbon impacted site. So he'll go through the background, the actual process, the results, and then we'll open it up to questions. And Gavin, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thank you, Angie. And thank you to all the attendees at this webinar. I hope this is very informative and pleasurable for you. And with that, we'll get started. So the first topic, as Angie mentioned, is the site background. So we'll jump right in. So this particular project deals with a former bulk fuel storage facility located on the St. Lawrence River. So on the right side of the screen here, you can see the outline of the site in black. That's the property border. You can see on the bottom right side of that figure there is a loading dock where tanker ships would come, offload their petroleum hydrocarbon products, and then that yellow line is a pipeline that would actually bring those various products to the north end of the site, where there was a series of large above ground storage tank farms, which would then hold the compounds until they were being redistributed to various locations by tanker trucks. So the types of petroleum hydrocarbon fuels that were stored at the site include kerosene, diesel, and bunker C oil. So a fairly wide range of products. If you think about that from a chemistry perspective, it's mostly what we call petroleum hydrocarbons in the fractions 2 to fraction 3 range. So kind of a mid-range size in terms of molecule size and mostly leaning towards the fraction 2, which may seem like a bit of a bit complex to get into that, but we'll kind of explain that as we go on through the presentation. In 1994, the site was partially decommissioned. I say partially decommissioned for a couple of reasons. One, only 11 of the 12 above ground storage tanks were removed. So one of the above ground storage tanks is still there to this day. That storage tank you can see in the northwest corner of the site. It's still actively used, but not for petroleum hydrocarbon products anymore. So in terms of our remediation, it was not an issue for concern. The red and green circles are the known locations of the storage tanks that were removed. And the other reason I say it is a partial decommissioning is because a lot of the underground pipe network that was used to connect these above ground storage tanks to the main line were simply left in place or cut into smaller pieces and buried at various locations throughout the site. And that happened to also be done in an undocumented way. And so we weren't aware of that until we started actually probing around the site, which made it for a bit of an interesting project as it unfolded. But again, we'll get to that in the future slides. So in 2017, the initial assessment was carried out by a different consultant. So on the right side of the screen here, you can see here's that same picture of the site, just with the satellite image removed. So the outline of the site is shown in red. And you can see all these green and red dots that are kind of scattered throughout the site, and those represent borehole samples for soil. So green is clean, and red is exceeding soil sample locations. And so you can see on the kind of the northwest and northeast corners of the site is where we found the contamination. 2021, that was verified by AEL. We came in, did some delineation work, and that's why there's a higher density of sample locations in those contaminated areas. And as you can kind of tell from this figure, the impacts do seem to be kind of isolated to the north side of the site. A lot of green dots to the south, and these impacts were primarily for petroleum hydrocarbons. As you might have guessed, given the chemistry of the materials that were stored on site, it's primarily for fraction 2, a little bit of fraction 3 as well, petroleum hydrocarbons. And then we also found some PAHs and BTECs, which are just compounds that you tend to find when you're dealing with fuel oils and things like that. So that wasn't unexpected either. It's worth noting that the soil at the site is primarily a very, very impermeable clay. And so because of that, we weren't expecting the contaminants to migrate far through the soil. And so we made the assumption that the contaminants were likely going to be just isolated to the northern half of the site. And that seemed to be verified by the clean boreholes to the south as well. So with that, we made plans for remediation. Our goal for remediation was to clean up the contaminated soil, and there was some contaminated groundwater as well in those areas of contamination. So we also wanted to clean up that. And we wanted to remediate those down to the criteria that was specified in the terms of sale. And that happened to be the Table 2 criteria from the Ministry of Environment, Conservation, and Parks. So jumping right in then to remediation. Our selected remediation approach was something we call biopiling. And all a biopile is essentially a bermed cell that's lined with plastic. And you take your contaminated soil, you excavate it out of the ground, and you deposit it at a maximum height of about 1.5 meters into these cells. And then you spray a mixture that we call biomix onto it. And biomix is simply, there's a couple components to it. There is a biosurfactant, which is essentially a fancy soap that pulls the contamination out of the soil and into the pore space within those biopiles where they can then be treated. There's an enzyme mixture, which then takes those petroleum hydrocarbon contaminants in the pore space and it chops them up into little small pieces that are more manageable. And then we have a bacteria and nutrient mixture, which acts to bioremediate those smaller pieces into harmless byproducts. And because it's a clay soil, it tends to hold on to the groundwater as you dig it. And so we didn't think that we needed to do any specific groundwater remediation. The groundwater would simply be excavated with the soil and treated in these biopiles. But just in case, we also installed some infiltration galleries inside the excavations prior to backfilling. And that way, if we had to come back and treat any residual contamination in the groundwater, we could just inject some sort of amendment for treatment of the groundwater through those infiltration galleries. And we also seeded the backfill with calcium peroxide, which is a slow oxygen release compound. So it's basically going to release oxygen very slowly into the groundwater at depth where it otherwise wouldn't be present, and stimulate the biodegradation naturally in the backfill excavation areas if there were any contaminants that need to be treated in that area. So jumping in to the actual excavation and biopiling, we began this work a few years back, and we quickly found that as we were digging that there was a much larger contaminated area than we had originally anticipated. And so on the right side of the screen here, you can see this is the same site image, just zoomed in a little bit. You can see the same boreholes, the green and red dots there, kind of showing you where the initial assessment and the delineation had taken place and where we found contaminants and where we didn't. And then you can see there's also these red shapes superimposed on top of that. And those are all the footprints of the excavations. So you can see in the northwest corner, or rather the northeast corner, excavation A kind of lines up with where we thought that the contamination would be. Same with excavation B in the northwest corner. And then you have these three new excavations that we didn't anticipate, excavations C, D, and E. And those are primarily related to the fact that we had those underground pipes causing preferential pathways, carting things around where we didn't expect them to be. And there was also it's worth noting, I should say, that excavations C, D, and E, there were boreholes all around them that were all clean. But because the site was a clay soil and because it was so large, they were just barely missed by those clean delineating boreholes. Whereas if you had a denser network of boreholes, you might have been able to find these and plan for them accordingly. So one of the lessons that we can draw already from this project at this point is that a little bit of extra care and planning and costs spent up front into the investigation can kind of save you from these unexpected surprises down the road. So to give you an idea of the scale of this, the original estimate was for roughly a little over 28,000 tons, which would take place over a 20-day period of excavation and biopiling. And in reality, we've spent about, I would say about 2.5 years of excavation, excavating about a little over 145,000 tons of contaminated soil. And as I mentioned, this is primarily due to preferential pathways, taking things along conduits where we didn't expect them to be. And so you can see here on the top right corner of the slide, there is a picture of some pipes that we unearthed. And these pipes, you can see underneath them, there's kind of this black goop. And that essentially is just the sand and gravel that's put in place around those pipes to protect them. And it's very high permeability soils, especially relative to the clay around it. And so the contamination will just flow through those as like almost like a superhighway, and it'll just conduit the contaminants to various locations throughout the site, and they kind of pop up in areas. And that's how the contamination is spread through the site so unexpectedly. And on the bottom right, again, you can kind of see the same picture. That's those pipes unearthed, and all that gray soil, that's all contaminated soil. It's kind of difficult to see on the bottom right slide, but you can also see there's a seam of contamination in the far wall of the excavation. And so what would happen is you'd have these pipes, the gravel and sand surrounding them would become saturated, and then the pressure of all the petroleum hydrocarbons in the storage tanks would force the contaminants out from the sand seams and into the clay, and sort of like a pancake layer formation. So to give you an idea what that looks like a little bit more clearly, here's just another picture of a test pit that was dug on site. So you can see there's the clean soil above and below it, and there's a kind of that gray seam, which is kind of a pancake layer that's oozing out along the path of least resistance from those buried pipes. So another preferential pathway that we had found that was transporting contaminants to the site was actually the roadway that was running through the center of the site itself. So this is a zoomed in satellite image of the property. You can see the roadway running north-south through the middle of that figure. And then the red outline is the excavation footprint. So you can see that the excavation footprint basically crosses through the roadway itself. The roadway was gravel. And if you think about the contaminant that's underneath it, every time it rains, the contaminants from that clay that's underneath the gravel roadway is going to seep up into the roadway, and then it's transported south along the roadway towards the site border. So we wanted to do a couple things. We wanted to first, obviously, stop the transport of that contaminated water. And secondly, we wanted to be able to excavate that contaminated soil from underneath the road. But that couldn't be done with the roadway saturated full of water, which was often the case just due to the wet climate of the area. So the solution we came up with was to install cutoff walls along the roadway. So a cutoff wall is basically you dig a trench through the gravel roadway and, excuse me, key it into the underlying clay, and then you backfill that trench with concrete, and that effectively cuts off the flow of water through the roadway at that location. And so we did that at multiple locations along the roadway, and that's what all those black lines represent on this figure. And then once we had a section of roadway completely cut off between two of these cutoff walls, we would dig a sump pit, dewater the gravel roadway, then we'd excavate the gravel, excavate the contaminated soil underneath it, put it in biopiles, reinstate the gravel, reinstate the roadway, and then move on. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like at the ground level, here's a picture of us. You can see the cutoff wall in the background there. The soil worked really well. The soil's pretty much all dry, and we were able to excavate the contaminated soil without any issues. So just to summarize the remediation from the biopile perspective, we biopiled about a little over 145,000 tons, almost 146,000 tons. That number is actually as of the end of last year. So this year we did do a little bit more excavation in the spring. So that number is probably closer to 150,000 tons total. It's worth noticing also that that excludes clean fill. So that's only contaminated soil put into biopiles. And if you think about the way the contamination was presenting itself at the site, which was primarily through a sort of a pancake layer that came out at depth from the pipes that were buried, you can probably double that number if you want to think about just plain earth moving around at the site. So very large scale operation, and a lot of logistics involved with that. And that was used to form, if you want to think about it in terms of distances, about 7.3 kilometers worth, or a little over 4.5 miles of biopiles. Just to kind of, I guess, hammer home the scale of this, here's a figure of the site before the project began. For scale, you can see in the bottom left corner, that's the tenant's building that's actively being used. You can see there's a bunch of semi-truck trailers parked there. So this is a very, very large site. And then this is what it looks like as of the end of last year. Excuse me. So you can see all those linear features that are scattered throughout the site. Those are all biopiles where soil treatment is actively progressing. And you might have noticed as well that the biopiles overlie a lot of the excavation areas. And so that is actually the fact. A lot of these biopiles are put on top of the backfill. So a lot of logistics, a lot of moving parts had to go on to make this work. There was also, at the same time, the roadway was being reinstated as we were excavating and making biopiles. So a lot of, as I said, moving parts going to make this all work seamlessly. And again, this is just another picture of a biopile being constructed. So you can see we've got our berms, we've got the plastic lining the berms in the cell itself, and then we have some geotextile just to give it some stability and strength. And these were just put all over the site to treat the soil. Backfilling, as I mentioned, we seeded all the backfill with calcium peroxide to give it that slow release oxygen, just in case there was some residual contaminants located in the bottom of the excavation. We were able to get all of our fill, or most of our fill, from the site itself. There was a bit of a pit dug in the one back corner where the soil was clean that was used to source most of the backfill material. So that was very handy. We could avoid bringing fill in and paying that cost. And then we also installed, as I mentioned, infiltration galleries. So nothing fancy for an infiltration gallery. It's just perforated pipe placed at the base of the excavation, cover that with gravel, seed it with an extra healthy dose of calcium peroxide, and then backfill it. You can see on the picture on the right here, that's actually one of the infiltration galleries prior to backfilling. So you see the mound of gravel, and then kind of that white powder on top is all the calcium peroxide. And then in the background, there's a riser pipe coming up. That's that pipe coming out of the gravel mound in the back. And that would be covered with backfill and just sticking a little bit out of the ground when this is all said and done. And we can use that as an access port to inject into if we need to in the future. It's worth noting that the groundwater monitoring that we carried out following the excavation and backfilling indicated there were no groundwater exceedances. So it seems that the calcium peroxide worked, and we didn't actually need to inject anything through the infiltration galleries. So jumping into some results. Before we get into the results in any depth, I just want to quickly go through the sampling protocol just to give you an idea of how that was done. So right up the top, we had to hand auger all these locations. And the reason for that is if we got any sort of drill rig on top of these biopiles, it would compress the biopile soil because it is clay, if it compresses, it doesn't really come back. It doesn't spring back like a sand would or something like that. And so if you compress a clay like that, you lose permeability. And if you lose permeability, the oxygen can't infiltrate down and spread throughout the soil so well. And because the bacteria that are going to be biodegrading the contaminants depend on oxygen, you can actually reduce the rate of remediation or even stall it out altogether completely. And so we wanted to avoid any heavy machinery on top of these piles. And so we had a group of folks, and I just want to tip my hat to them. They went and hand augered a lot of holes through these piles, through the clay, which is really tough work. So quick shout out to them, the AEL field staff. So anyways, they would go and collect 4 feet total of samples at 1 foot depth intervals, put them into Ziploc bags, 1 foot intervals at a time. And then we take those Ziploc bags and we screen them on site using our portable site lab. So the portable site lab is a combination of a gas analyzer, which just measures the headspace inside the actual sample bag. And then there's a UVF component as well. UVF is an ultraviolet fluorescence detector. And so what happens there is we take a small piece of the soil, about 10 grams, extract all the petroleum hydrocarbons out of it, and then we analyze it using a fluorescent ray, and that excites the petroleum hydrocarbons. They emit radiation backwards at us, and then you can, or not at us, but at the detector, and then you can kind of see quantitatively how much contaminant is in that soil sample. And so the reason we did both of these is usually most people just go with the gas analyzer and that's it. But if you actually combine the gas analyzer, which gives you a very broad, coarse sort of reading for what the soil might have, but then you combine it with something more specific like the UVF, but the UVF, even though it's very specific, it's also very accurate. So you can combine those two and they synergistically work together to give you more information. And we noticed that our correlation curve went up by an order of magnitude using both. And so that's why we use kind of that combined approach. So based off of that screening, we were able then to submit laboratory verification samples. About 12.5% of all samples then get submitted for laboratory verification. So a little bit more about the screening process. To date, we've collected about 217 samples, and those are plotted up here on the left side of the screen. So this is a plot showing the screening sample results on the y-axis. And again, the screening sample results is just a combination of the UVF and the Eagle gas analyzer readings, which are both measured in parts per million. So you sum those and plot those on that axis. And then on the x-axis is the laboratory results. And so you can see here, the correlation is about 0.27, which is not super accurate. So you can't actually make a predictive assumption just based off the correlation itself. And so what we did is we made confidence intervals. So we said, okay, at what screening criteria will 100% of the samples we submit to the lab all come back as clean? And that's actually shown by that green line that runs across the bottom of the graph. And then the yellow line above that is 95% confidence that all the samples that hit that screening criteria or less are going to be clean, and so on and so forth. And so that helps us to generate a site-specific screening criteria where we said, okay, we're only going to submit samples to the lab if they are below that 95% clean screening criteria. And in that way, you can avoid submitting a lot of confirmation samples to the laboratory that would otherwise fail, and then you'd have to go back and resample that location. So it's just a way to save the client some money by not submitting multiple lab samples to the same location, just waiting for them to get clean. So based off of that approach, to date, we've been able to decommission 10% of the biopiles. Again, this presentation was written at the end of last year. This year, we've actually carried out a bit more of a scope of work. So we've carried out that summer, fall 2024 scope of work partially. So 30% more biopiles have actually been decommissioned. So decommissioned just means that the piles have been completely fully treated. They're clean, and we bulldoze them back and regrade them into the landscape. So roughly 40% of the biopiles have been decommissioned. And then this fall, we plan to sample the remaining 60% of the biopiles, and we're aiming for fall 2025 site closure. So I'd just like to acknowledge some folks before we wrap this up. Rory and Ross and Jason from Thomason Group. So they were Thomason we partnered with on this job. They supplied all the excavation equipment, helped with all the demolition and logistical planning for backfilling, and they supplied the rock trucks, etc. So they've been an integral part of this project. And then Paul as well from our office, who was part of the planning and oversight as well. And with that, thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, Gavin, thank you so much for going through all of that with everyone. And I trust that it was value to everyone. And I do see that there are a few questions that have come in. So I will pass those your way in the order that they came in, and leave it to you. And we'll start with the first one. Did you do anything to manage the emission of volatiles into the air?
Right, so that's a great question. No, we did not. The volatiles, because we were primarily looking at fractions 2 and fractions 3 in the chemical composition, now there wasn't a whole lot of BTEX or F1 present when we did their initial delineation or when we did our subsequent confirmation sampling of the biopiles. We did have the Eagles, like the gas analyzers, running at the site borders and just looking for spikes to see if anything was happening. But we didn't really find any air contamination as we were going. Also, just by nature of the clay substance that we were treating, it does tend to kind of encapsulate and hold on to the vapors if there are any generated. So we didn't really see any particular need to do that. There was no venting. A lot of times biopiles will also have air pumped into them, which we did not do. This is all very just passive, sitting, just working by itself, no ventilation. Yeah, so long answer, or short, to make a short answer of the long answer, I guess, no, we did not have to do anything for the emissions to air.
Excellent. And second question that came in, did you do any microbiological testing on the soil to see if the bacteria were active?
No, we did not do any microbiological testing. We just we took the just the petroleum hydrocarbon degradation results as our primary analysis, and we would have gone further into that if we felt like things were stalling out or it wasn't working as planned. But because it worked so well, it was kind of like one of those things that we didn't feel like we had to look into.
All right. And did you segregate metals contamination from the hydrocarbon impacted soils before treatment?
Metals contamination. So we never had any metals contamination, so we didn't feel like we had to. Like there was it was basically all petroleum hydrocarbons, PAHs, and a little bit of BTEX here and there, basically. No metals contamination.
Okay. How thick were the piles in general? Did you do any pile turning or addition of other amendments during the process?
Right. So the piles were about 3 to 4 feet, depending on where you are. There were a couple piles where we, because we ran out of space, we actually did what we call the double lift pile. So we would put some perforated pipe on the top of the pile and then add another 3 feet of soil on top of that. That worked pretty well. But yeah, in terms of soil turning or adding additional amendment, we haven't had to do any of that yet. It's treated fairly quickly, which I was quite pleased with considering the clay nature of the soil, which doesn't allow for a lot of oxygen delivery. It seemed to work quite well. We may be doing some soil turning potentially in the future if the results come back as a little bit more exceeding than we had thought. But to date, things have been cleaning up quite rapidly. And so we haven't had the need to turn the soil or add additional amendments or anything like that.
You had mentioned that the climate was fairly wet. Do biopiles work better or worse in different environments, like colder, drier, hotter?
Yes, so it's kind of there's a bit of a sweet spot for all those different factors. So if you have a biopile that's very, very wet all the time, you can't get that much oxygen down to the base of the pile because the water just prevents it from migrating. But if it's not wet enough, you don't have enough water to support the bacterial life, and you need some water to basically host the enzymes because they don't float in the air. They need the water to actually transport them throughout the pile. So you kind of want there's like a Goldilocks zone in terms of saturation of water. In terms of like hotness, dryness, I mean, bacteria are most active around 30 degrees Celsius. So summer weather is usually the best. If you get too far north, you get a shorter treatment season. But we have done these biopiles, in the Arctic, and they do work. They just take maybe a little bit longer. I'm trying to think if there's any other factors that really come to play. There's heat, there's moisture content. I think those are the two big ones. There's soil texture. Generally speaking, if you have too coarse of a soil, like a gravel, then the water, like the amendments just tend to kind of wash out to the bottom of the pile. And so you got to be careful with that. You'd be more better off with like a soil washing technique at that point. But if you have like we had with the clay, the big challenge is getting oxygen through the clay and getting transport through the clay because it's such a small pore size. The soil grains are so small. So it's realistically a sandy loam is probably the ideal soil for biopiling, but as has been shown by this project and also other projects where we actually have biopiled like a sandy gravel, it all works, just different rates. So, yep.
All right, you got lots of questions coming in, Gavin. This is great.
Okay.
I'm going to try to just
Stuff.
group them together a little bit, but
Sure.
relating to what you're just discussing, did you face issues with volumes of runoff that was contaminated, and did you have to treat any runoff from the biopiles?
Right. So we didn't have any runoff. We built our piles so that the berms would be high enough to capture a lot of, like the berms were, for the most part, were about a foot to 2 feet higher than the base of the pile. So you had the pile and your berm would kind of stick up. So that little V section was using enough volume to hold any major rainfall events. And then the clay itself, it can hold a lot of water, so it will slowly soak into the clay. And you also get evaporation. So we had some pretty powerful storms and we never really had any runoff issues. We did have one occurrence where some of the biopiles were built into a bit of a depression and that depression flooded. But we tested the water afterwards, and we also tested some of the soil surface samples of that depressed area after it dried out, and there was no contamination there. I think largely because those piles had already been treating for a year, so there wasn't much contaminants left in that area, so we kind of lucked out in that regard. But if you're worried about that sort of thing, you can, and it's recommended to spread like poly sheet over top of the piles. So that the water will kind of shed off the top. The trade-off there is that if you cover your piles with plastic, you get less oxygen availability because you're lowering the area that you can have oxygen kind of contact with the surface of the soil and infiltrate into the soil. So it's a bit of again, it's that Goldilocks zone. You got to kind of consider the soil texture you have. You got to consider the climate you're in, and kind of make a decision based off of that.
Perfect. Do you think photo degradation of the contaminants may have contributed significantly?
I don't think so. Largely because the surface to volume ratio of these piles is pretty small. So you have basically just the top of the biopile, and then you have a much larger amount of the soil that's buried fairly deep. There wasn't a ton of, like, the soil wasn't kind of sitting baking out in the sun, like all spread out. It's basically excavated into a rock truck, taken over, dumped into the pile. So there might be some. I would say probably not a ton though.
Perfect. Can you please recap the process of the biopile installation and the components used?
Sure. So in terms of biopile installation, maybe I can just back up some slides. So this is a pretty good picture. I think that illustrates how we installed the piles themselves. So the pile is just two berms, or four. It's just a cell that is basically surrounded by bermed soil. We just use the native soil on site, so we would take an excavator, build these berms up on the side just in a native soil. Then we cover the whole thing with poly sheeting. If you want, you can get like more durable, resistant plastic as opposed to just poly sheet. But considering the site was made out of clay materials already, and we also use geotextile to give it some strength, so we thought that would be sufficient to prevent any sort of leakage. Anyway, so you line your cell with the plastic, you put the geotextile down, and then you just simply start loading the biopile with soil. We loaded with soil a couple different ways. It was kind of, there were some ways that were better than others. Here you can see the excavators, or the rock truck is dumping the soil beside the biopile in a staging area, and then the excavator is taking it from there and putting it into the biopile. So that's one way you can do it. It's the cleanest way. It's the easiest way to install the piles themselves, because you're not driving on top of the pile. As soon as you start driving on top of the pile, you start compressing the soil, and then you run into those issues again with the oxygen delivery. So the only issue with staging the soil like this is that you have to make sure you clean up the staging area. Otherwise, you're dumping contaminated soil onto basically a flat prepped area. So you got to make sure that area is scraped up a little bit. So you might generate a bit of extra soil volume that goes into the biopiles just by scraping and cleaning that staging area. You can also drive the rock trucks or dump trucks or whatever you're using right onto the biopiles themselves and dump it in. The only thing you got to be wary about there, especially if you're on like a squishy soil like we were here, is you start getting ruts, and then the ruts start pulling at the plastic, and then you can get rips in the plastic, so you lose containment, and you completely deform the shape of your cell, and so all the biomix will tend to collect inside those ruts, and so you might have these kind of trenches where you have either enhanced treatment, but the rest doesn't get treatment because it's drained there, or you might have lower oxygen delivery in the ruts, so you get less treatment, so you have these little pockets that are left over. So there's that to consider. In the end, we found that staging it like this, or dumping sort of a 2-foot base and then driving the rock trucks backwards and dumping it from the front to back. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but there's a bunch of different ways you can install this, and you have to kind of consider, again, the specifics of your site and how you want to do it to maximize the efficiency of both the soil being loaded and how it's loaded, so that it treats better in the future when it's actually sprayed with the biomix. In terms of the biomix itself, it is a mixture of a biosurfactant, which I think I called it a fancy soap. It's essentially a detergent that is amenable with bacterial life, so it's not going to lyse your bacteria, or basically just pop it, because if it's a regular soap, you can mess up your bacteria pretty good. So there's that. That pulls the contaminants off of the soil, much like it would pull grease off your hands if you wash them with soap and water. So now you have all this contaminants floating in the water within the soil pore space of these biopiles. There's also a enzyme, which an enzyme basically cuts up organic molecules into smaller pieces. So that's what it does. It targets these specific hydrocarbons and chops them up from, if you remember, they were fraction 2 to fraction 3, it'll chop them up. That just refers to the carbon chain length. So it'll chop them up into like, if you want to think about like less than a fraction 1. So they're very, very small sections of carbon chain, which bacteria find them easier to digest. And so the bacteria that are also in that mixture will then, they'll target those molecules for their metabolism, and they will digest them. And when they digest them, they basically incorporate those into their cell structure, or they release harmless byproducts as a end result. And so at the end of the day, that whole kind of cascade of events creates clean soil, and that's what you're left with. So I hope that is fairly in depth, but I hope that helps.
Thank you, Gavin. Yeah, that was a good question. We still have 3 more right now, so have a sip of water. And
Yeah, good idea.
but they're all great questions. So I really
Mhm.
thank everyone who's been sending them in. Um, did you do anything to encourage or discourage the growth of weeds on the piles?
We did nothing to encourage it, but they came. To the extent that we some of these places had weeds that were taller than our field staff, so they disappear right in there. And so we were debating at this point bringing in like a weed whacker or something to clear spots out for sampling. But while we didn't encourage any growth of weeds, I think there's no harm in them. I think they work synergistically with the biomix, so you get kind of a phytoremediation approach as well that kind of kicks into effect after a year or so. Yeah, we haven't seen any detrimental effects. We haven't specifically looked into their effect experimentally, to be fair, but we haven't seen any stagnation really of piles that have a lot of weeds grown on them. But neither have we seen them really treat at significantly faster rates than piles that which do not yet have weeds on them. So it's very difficult to say what impact they have, but no, we neither encouraged or discouraged their growth.
Is there a lifespan that you know for the poly sheets that are used?
That is a good question. I do not know the lifespan off the top of my head. It would be longer than the time it takes these to treat, though, because typically these will treat within, at least in like a temperate climate, one summer season, maybe 2 summer seasons is what you'd expect. If it gets a little bit colder, like towards the Arctic, maybe you're looking at a little bit longer, but you're also getting typically more gravelly soils in the Arctic, so it ends up being like a couple summers regardless, anyways. So if you're worried about, the plastic failing and things leaching out, I don't think that would be an issue you would face. But in terms of cleanup, if you wanted to dig that plastic back out later, or just wait for it to naturally degrade, I couldn't tell you how long that would take.
A good one to look up for the next webinar.
Yes.
All right. We actually have 2 questions that I think are basically the same questions.
Okay.
Were there any competing options under serious consideration for the scenario presented? So were there any other options you were considering for treatment, and why did you select the approach you took?
Yeah, we were considering like an ISCO at first, but given the clay nature of the soil, injections weren't really going to be a thing. Another one we were thinking about again is just a surfactant extraction, but again, it was that clay soil that just made it very difficult. So we really needed to excavate the soil in some manner and treat it sort of ex situ. So we could have just excavated and gone to landfill, but that would have been ridiculously expensive. If you think of like a tipping fee of like, I don't know, even like call it $100 for 90 to $100 for unhazardous or non-hazardous soil. If you're talking, 250,000 tons, multiply that by 100, it's a lot of money just for tipping fees. So treating it on site was something we really wanted to do, just to cut down on that sort of extra cost. And so it was between the biomix and like a biosurfactant, and at the end of the day, this way the waste or the contaminants are not only removed from the soil, but they're also destroyed by the bacteria. And so other technologies could potentially remove the contaminants from the soil, but not treat it, and not for the same price. The cost was a big driver on this one, and this was the most cost efficient method of doing it.
Perfect. So I think there's still a couple of other things we wanted to cover. I'm going to do one last question, and from there, if anyone else has questions that we couldn't get to, I will, on the next slide, or the next couple of slides, you're going to see Gavin's contact information. And by all means, reach out to him and he can answer your questions if there's anything specific that you need or want answered. So the last question that I wanted to, that we're going to take today is whether you can use the biomix in other formats, such as injecting into the subsurface or mixing into surface water to treat the contaminants in place. And I think you might have
Yep.
touched on that a little bit already.
Yeah. Like you can definitely inject it into surface water. So long as there's enough. Basically the big components are you need enough water to support the transport of the bacteria and the enzymes and the biosurfactant throughout the contaminated soil or whatever you're trying to treat. And you need enough oxygen to support the bacterial function. So surface water, shallow surface water definitely can be used. Subsurface, absolutely. You might want to consider injecting it along with something like that releases oxygen, like that calcium peroxide to support the bacteria. Yeah, really the same chemistry could be applied anywhere as long as those conditions are met. So, yep.
Perfect. All right. We've still got 10 minutes. I'm going to give you one more question,
Sure.
Gavin, and then we'll just roll on to wrap up. And stick around because we're doing a giveaway to everyone who's on the call. So don't drop off just yet. But do you think that this treatment plan will affect the pH of the soil due to calcium peroxide? Could it lead to sensitive soil in the event of an RSC, like changing from table 2 to table 1?
I don't think that calcium peroxide, and I'm not a chemist, so, but I don't, so yeah, that's a caveat, but I don't think that the calcium peroxide would change the pH of the soil. When we went back and just anecdotally anyways, when we went back and sampled groundwater wells that were installed from within the actual excavation, like the backfill of the excavation itself, we did low flow sampling, right? So we're analyzing the pH among other things as we're purging the wells, and we did not. The pH was all in the acceptable range. So I don't think it would. And the calcium peroxide as well is, I think its effects are limited to, I think like a year or 2 years. The person, so I think it's like 2 years before it's all used up, and I think after that point, things are going to go back to normal anyways. And I don't think that the release of oxygen purely as a primary mechanism would change the pH too much.
And maybe if there's a specific situation, if there's a specific situation, if we could, if you wanted to email us your question, we could look into it a little bit deeper, get a subject matter expert on it.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. And Gavin, if you can just advance back to, I guess, to where we were, and then the next slide. Just have a little bit of wrap up here. Okay, so first of all, again, just thank you to everyone who joined us. And if you are interested in remediation, which it seems like we've got a pretty interested group here, we'd love to invite you to explore other remedial approaches and advancements in the industry. We're actually delivering a presentation a month from now that's hosted by the Ontario Education Collaborative Marketplace. So they have booked us for September 18th at 1 p.m. You can use the QR code. In addition, in the follow-up to this webinar, where we've got the presentation, there will be a link there as well, so you can join. And the goals of that presentation are insights into the latest remedial technologies and methodologies, an appreciation for how modern remediation tactics are benefiting the planet versus traditional methods, regulatory impacts on remediation processes, practical knowledge of modern remedial amendments and their applications, and how to achieve a record of site condition or other end goals faster or more affordably by combining specific site-specific risk assessments and remediation. So keep an eye out for that link coming through. If you haven't already signed up, it'll be on our social media and all those other good places. And last but not least, if for everyone who's joined us today and taken the time out of their day to join us live, we're actually going to wrap up by sending out a lucky participant a AEL 25th anniversary swag box. So I'll be sending an email in just a moment with a link for the winner to just fill out an address where we can ship it. It's handled by a third party, totally discreet. But yeah, it's a really cool swag gift, and you can have your own AEL hat and coasters and notebooks delivered right to your door. So thank you all so much for attending. And I hope that if you have any other questions that you feel welcome to reach out. You've got Gavin's contact, which we presented on the previous slide, but also you can just reach out to info@AEL or through our website contact form. If you're not already subscribed to our newsletter, please, we welcome you to do so to stay up to date on the latest industry news. And if you've got any specific questions, or if there's anyone, if we can arrange an information session with you or anyone on your team, by all means, reach out. We're more than happy to share our knowledge and connect with you on your site-specific needs. So we thank you all so much and hope to speak with you soon. Thank you, Gavin.